All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Again, this is the Council of State Government's first webinar on the legacy of the ADA. My name is Dina Klimkina and I'm a program manager at the Council of State Governments. On July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. An act modeled after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the ADA represents the most comprehensive disability rights legislation in history. The ADA outlined 4 goals of disability policy: equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Sunday, July 26th, marked the 30th anniversary of this landmark legislation. Over the past 30 years, the ADA and comparable state non-discrimination legislation has resulted in notable improvements to the public accommodations, transportation, independent and community living, and employment for individuals with disabilities, amongst other changes. The anniversary provides an occasion to both commemorate the ADA, to reflect on its significance and the progress we've made over the last 3 decades, and to map out an even more inclusive future. To celebrate this landmark legislation, the Council of State Governments, in partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, is hosting a 6-part webinar series exploring the origin and legacy of the ADA. Learn about the evolution of the ADA and its impacts on state policies, businesses, and communities over the past 30 years, along with policies and programs that can help enhance disability employment policy in your state. Today's webinar will cover the inception and establishment and legacy of the ADA. I'd like to thank our moderator, Commissioner D'Arcangelo, and our incredible panel of speakers. The Office of Disability Employment Policy, the State Exchange on Employment and Disability, and our partners at the Cornell Yankton Institute on Employment and Disability in developing this web series. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items. Next slide. To follow along with captioning, open the captioning webpage in a new browser. You can click on the link posted in the chat box, as well as the link displayed here on your screen. You can adjust the background color, text color, and font using the drop-down menus of the top browser. To make sure to click back to the webinar browser and position the window to sit directly above the captioning or wherever is comfortable for you. This session has been pre-approved for Certified Rehabilitation Counselor credits. If you need verification of completion, please let us know in the survey, which will follow the webinar via email. For those not seeking CRC credits, specifically, all participants will receive a certificate of completion at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, submit them through the questions panel, and we'll save time at the end of the Q&A. To change the view to speaker view or presentation view, you can click on the button in the top left of the screen. It is to the right of the webcam feature and the talking feature on the left-hand side. This webinar will be available via video on our website, and slides will also be available in accessible PDF format on the seed.csg.org. We will also be able to provide transcripts as well. Without further delay, let's get started. Next slide. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Commissioner David D'Arcangelo. As the Commissioner for Massachusetts Commission for the Blind, David oversees the agency for delivery of highest quality vocational and social rehabilitation services to individuals with blindness. Prior to his role, David served as Director for the Massachusetts Office of Disability, 3 terms as the Malden City Councilor at Large as well. David served on the National Work Matters Task Force to help design the framework for states for workforce development policy for people with disabilities, as well as the future of the Workforce Task Force. So we're incredibly excited to have him today. David, over to you.
Dina, thank you so much, and many thanks to the Council on State Governments, the whole SEED team, all of the organizations helping contribute to today's webinar, certainly our panelists. It's great to be with you. It's David D'Arcangelo, and I'm so pleased to be here. We've got a great panel for you today to talk about the ADA and celebrate 30 years of this landmark law. I do want to take a moment though, and I would ask that we all take a moment of silence to remember a great man, Congressman John Lewis, an important civil rights leader. There are ceremonies taking place right now, and if we could all just take a moment of silence out of respect for Congressman Lewis. Thank you very much. So hello again, it's David Darkangelo. It's great to be with you. I'm so pleased to moderate this ADA All-Star panel. Allow me to introduce our panelists today. We have Jill Houghton, Lex Frieden, and Bobby Silverstein. Jill Houghton is president and CEO of DisabilityOwned, which is an organization that provides guidance on global disability inclusion and best practices for companies. Jill leads the effort to empower over 200 leading companies to achieve disability inclusion and equality. Ms. Houghton has over 25 years of leadership experience at the local, state, and federal levels, working with businesses to advance the inclusion of individuals with disabilities. Jill, thank you for joining us today. Lex Frieden. Lex is currently a professor of Biomedical Informatics and Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. Mr. Frieden also directs the Independent Living Research Utilization Program, which is a comprehensive medical rehabilitation center with clinical, educational, and research programs for spinal cord, brain injuries, and other disabling conditions. Mr. Frieden served as the executive director to the National Council on Disability from 1984 through 1988. It was instrumental in the conception of the ADA. Thank you, Lex. From 2002 to 2006, he was appointed by President George W. Bush as chairperson of the National Council on Disability. Welcome, Lex.
Thank you, David.
And Bobby Silverstein. Robert Bobby Silverstein was the staff director and chief counsel to U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy between 1987 and 1997, and chief aide to Senator Tom Harkin, who is the primary sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Thank you, Bobby. Bobby has been referred to as the behind-the-scenes architect of the ADA. Currently, Bobby is legislative counsel to the State Exchange on Employment and Disability and a principal in the law firm of Powers, Piles, Sutter, and Verville. Thank you, Bobby. Welcome.
Thank you.
So we have organized our webinar into 4 sections today. First, prologue to the ADA will take about 20 minutes. Second, creation of the ADA, which we'll talk about for about 20 minutes. And then third, success and opportunities for the ADA. Again, we'll talk about for 20 minutes. We'll then have about 30 minutes of question and answers for the panel. But we're going to have a robust talk here today, hopefully a free-flowing discussion. We want to try to make it interactive for you. So if you do have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try our best to address those. So as I indicated, each of the first 3 sections will last approximately 20 minutes, and then we're going to have questions, so we're looking forward to those. So we're hoping to add some interactivity as well. So let's begin with prologue to the ADA. So with the ADA being in place for 30 years now, an entire generation of Americans have grown up with and can only remember living under the rights and guidance established by this landmark legislation, me among them. So thank you, Bobby and Lex, personally. First question for Bobby. Bobby, can you share some examples of life before the ADA and really what needed to change? Maybe you can talk a little bit about life before the ADA, what needed to change, and I think you might have some slides for examples of accessibility.
Yeah, well, thanks again for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. You know, I'm going to go way back and answer your question. I'm going to go back to the philosophers. Hippocrates asked the question, which children should be reared? You're going to be dismayed at the answers from Plato and Aristotle. Plato said, and I'm quoting, society should leave the unhealthy to die, and those whose psychological constitution are incurably corrupt, society will put to death. That seems to be the best thing for both the individual sufferer and for society. Aristotle was in full agreement with regard to the choice between abandoning an infant or rearing it. He said, "Let there be a law that no crippled child be reared." Not surprising that our society, our country, relying in part on these, quote, great thinkers, developed ugly laws. Change the slide, please. This is an example of a law that was from Chicago that was on the books until 1974. It basically said no person who is disease, maimed, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object shall be allowed in or on the public ways, subject to fine and penalty. We had exclusion from public education. A Wisconsin Supreme Court had to deal with a question of whether a child with cerebral palsy could be excluded from public education, and the answer was absolutely yes. Why? Because the court said that the child's ailment produces a depressing and nauseating effect on teachers and school children. We had forced sterilization in this country. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, speaking for the US Supreme Court, said yes, an individual with a developmental disability could be sterilized against her will, quote, in order to prevent her being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crimes or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can and must prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Justice Thurgood Marshall, in another Supreme Court case, described our treatment of people with disabilities as grotesque and worse than the worst excesses of Jim Crow laws. So that's part of the history that we as a society need to address.
Very difficult, but I think that's important basis to be able to set why we need to have these important anti-discrimination laws. This question's to Lex. Lex, can you share some of the findings from reports created at the time that helped build momentum for establishment of the ADA?
Well, David, first I'd like to share my own personal experience. I broke my neck in a car accident in 1967 and finished rehabilitation in 1968 with the perspective that I could go out and do anything that I wanted to do that I could have done before my neck was broken, except I had to figure out how to do it on 4 wheels. And that did not seem to be too challenging at the time, given the fact that we had astronauts on the way to the moon. So I immediately applied to go to college at a university near my home. And weeks later, not too long after that, I received a letter telling me that I was not eligible for admission to the university. I called to clarify the matter and was told that the university had a policy not to admit students who had disabilities. I argued about that on the phone, but soon learned that the university had the right to create whatever policies for admission and whatever standards it wanted to create. And that set me back a few months in terms of my adjustment to the disability. After that, I learned about the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which included what many people with disabilities at the time considered to be the independence for people with disabilities. And that really was a giant step forward in Title V. It also awakened the disability community because no regulations were created to actually implement the law. So we organized nationwide. There were groups of advocates in Houston, in Boston, in Lansing, Michigan, in Berkeley, and around the country that almost spontaneously came together, organized the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. And we objected to the fact that the government did not have any means to implement this important piece of legislation because there were no regulations. And eventually, as anyone who's looked at the history knows, in 1978, Secretary Califano signed the regulations, and we can finally enforce the 1973 amendments. But the saga went on because despite that, people were facing discrimination. And when President Reagan was elected, he actually asked Vice President Bush to strip the regulations on education for handicapped children. And Bush began the process of reviewing those regulations and heard from hundreds and hundreds of parents of people with disabilities, mostly at that time, who were concerned that their kids now would lose some of their rights that were granted them under the 1975 Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. So the administration began to be aware of this group of people with disabilities, and President Reagan appointed a council that was set up by the Senate and the House called the National Council on the Handicapped, now the National Council on Disability. And we began to have hearings around the country, bringing in the voices of people with disabilities. Justin Dart, my fellow Texan, toured the nation 3 times to get input from people with disabilities. That input was wrapped up into a report called Toward Independence. The first recommendation in Toward Independence was that there be a law protecting people with disabilities from discrimination. Because it was a conservative Republican administration, we actually referred to it as an equal opportunity law. But we all knew it was a civil rights act for people with disabilities.
Yes.
Congress did not act on that recommendation. So in 1988, my colleague Bob Bergdorf in the council helped prepare a draft piece of legislation that we named the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we put that forward in a report called On the Threshold to Independence. Lowell Weicker, the senator from Connecticut, introduced the bill. Tony Coelho introduced it in the House of Representatives. It had some substantial co-sponsorship. Tom Harkin, who stood up at first on behalf of the Democrats to support the bill. And after that, we had Paul Simon and Ted Kennedy and a number of other outspoken leaders in the Congress who came forward. So that actually set the wheels in motion. And then after that particular Congress died at the end of 1988, there were presidential elections. George Bush, who had committed to support the ADA initiative before he was elected, stated before his first joint meeting of the Congress that he intended to sign a bill before he ended his presidency, granting people with disabilities equal opportunity. So there were a lot of people think the ADA just popped up in a couple of years and had hearings and was passed. Not so. I think Bobby's history laid a nice foundation, and then activism by people with disabilities around the country through the 1970s and 80s really provided the groundwork and the framework for the ADA.
Yes. First of all, Lex, thank you. I don't know where I'd be today if your advocacy wasn't as robust. So thank you. Thank you to Bobby too. You mentioned Justin Dart, Ed Roberts. Really, it was a whole movement that you were a part of. So, but I do want to go back to Bobby for a second. You mentioned the hearings. Bobby, could you give us your prerogatives and tell us what you learned through these hearings? You were on Capitol Hill.
Sure. After we had one hearing on the 1988 version of the ADA, and then folks got together with the disability community and members of Congress and introduced a revised version of the ADA. And then we had another set of hearings, extensive hearings on the Senate side and even more so on the House side. Here are some of the quick things we learned. We learned about a graduate from Harvard Law School who couldn't get any interviews. He was blind. And to kind of make things simple, a lot of companies, law firms, first question would be, do you have a disability? The second question might be, did you graduate from Harvard? But you never got to the second question. So that's what he testified about. Judy Heumann testified about a person with polio couldn't get to be a teacher in New York City. We learned from a situation in New Jersey where kids with developmental disabilities were kicked out of a zoo because the zookeeper was concerned that their presence would adversely affect the chimpanzees. We learned about a Vietnam vet who came back and said, I lost my limbs in defense of freedom and I can't even get on a bus to go to work. We learned from Lisa Coral, a child with cerebral palsy, was kicked out of a local theater because the theater owner didn't like the way she looked. These are the kinds of things that we heard over and over again to lay the basis for the enactment of the legislation.
I guess we've come a long way in 30 years. I know there's still a long ways to go, but again, clearly we've come a long way with some of those stories that you're talking about here. Jill, I do want to bring you in here, make sure we get some perspective from you on the prologue to the ADA. Do you have something to add here?
I mean, we're among giants, right? It's an honor to be here with Lex and Bobby and to learn the history that we have benefited from and joined in together with our leaders to continue to move forward because we got a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jill. And to Bobby and to Lex, both of you, as we now going to segue into our next segment here, creation of the ADA. But before I start with the first question in that segment, can we talk a little bit about some of the terms that we know so well now? Reasonable accommodation, reasonable modifications, interactive process. Can you talk a little bit about that and how those were being thought about through these hearings and being put in the then bill, what ended up becoming law?
Let me give Bobby an intro on that. We at first thought the disability rights legislation could fit into the civil rights law. And
the 64 Civil Rights Act?
Yes, exactly. And in fact, there were a few efforts to amend the 64 Act that were sort of failed quickly. But the issue there that many people had was the whole, what they called the difference between what we were talking about and the discrimination that they understood. And it all got down at some point to how you actually respond to discrimination. They didn't argue that people with disabilities had disparate treatment, but some argued that there was justification for that. Others argued that even if it were disparate treatment, there were no provisions in the 64 Act that would actually provide any kind of relief to people with disabilities. And so that then led to a discussion which started back in 1973 and then led to the point at which Bobby can talk about where the decisions had to be made in terms of building this legislation.
Bobby, you want to follow up on that?
Sure, David. When I talk to policymakers, I don't use those legal mumbo jumbo or disability jargon because in some cases it gives the wrong impression. It gives the impression of special treatment. Yeah, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the notion of all means all. Everybody is entitled to effective and meaningful opportunity to participate. When a non-disabled person sits at a desk, do you call the desk a reasonable accommodation? Do you call the chair a reasonable accommodation? Do you call the computer or the telephone a reasonable accommodation? No, it's a tool for effective and meaningful opportunity. Reasonable accommodation simply says that those tools should be work for everybody, effective and meaningful. And that means modifying software. It may mean for a deaf person to have an interpreter. But so that to me is the core principle that is included in the ADA, and put aside the disability jargon.
Yes.
And get to the core policy that is we're trying to address.
Yeah, you articulated it very well, Bobby. And it's really like nothing about us without us, right? And having people with disabilities in on their own destiny here, I think, is a departure from way back with the Smith-Fess Act and some of the other laws that you had alluded to earlier, where it was those people with disabilities, and those people with disabilities weren't necessarily included in the decision making. So, all right, great topic. We could keep going there, but we're going to shift gears now a little bit here, and we're going to go into the creation of the ADA. So this question will be to all the panelists, but we'll start with Bobby. So Bobby, can you talk about how the advocates and lawmakers created a window of opportunity to foster passage of the ADA? And if you could bring in some of the political context of how it all came together. I know Lex kind of teased that out a little bit, but if you could fill us on, because you were there, you were on Capitol Hill.
I was in the rooms where it happened, to quote Hamilton. Think about it, a comprehensive civil rights statute for people with disabilities. What did it take to make this happen? What was the confluence of events? It started with Lex and the National Council on Disabilities making that compelling case. Secondly, it involved a disability community that was cohesive and unified. Policymakers on the phone may often deal with a group that represents a particular disability versus another, and the factions that sometimes go. What happened in this case, every Friday they met at the local Methodist church. They closed the door. They, pardon the French, beat the crap out of each other, debated, discussed, opened the door, and came out unified.
This was in DC?
This was in DC. Third, you had the business community. You had state and local government officials fully engaged in the process, recognizing, as Lex had said, that President-elect had said to the public, in fact, in the first joint session of Congress, that he was going to support an omnibus civil rights statute for people with disabilities. Bipartisanship. This is the major message. This was not a Democrat, a Republican, liberal, or conservative initiative. This was bipartisan. And there were profiles encouraged by policymakers. Think what it would mean for a Republican president to announce support for a comprehensive civil rights statute. And a lot of the members who made this happen on both sides of the aisle, now we can all celebrate. It was no big deal. But remember, we were in the middle of the HIV/AIDS crisis where folks didn't understand what HIV was. And to have people with AIDS and HIV positive included in the civil rights statute was immense. And Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah, was a key player in this regard. And then we had what I call principled pragmatism. There was an effort by all stakeholders to balance the rights of people with disabilities with the legitimate concerns of state and local government and businesses. And that's the confluence of events that made this landmark legislation possible.
Yes. Lex, Jill, do you want to follow up on how you feel the advocates and lawmakers created a window of opportunity? What was it like?
Well, I mean, Bobby's described it all very well, that some of the nuances that occurred were interesting, and I think people might be interested that this bill had to go through 5 houses or 5 committees in the House of Representatives. That's an extraordinary number of committees that had to approve the bill before it could even get to the floor of the House for consideration. And each one of those committee chairs and each one of the ranking members on those committees had a lot to say about this bill. And at any point in time along that process, had somebody taken a sort of a radical end run on the bill, had tried to change the substance of it, we would have had a lot of problems. But the leadership in the House, Steny Hoyer at the time, before him Tony Coelho, and a ranking member of a key committee. I mean, both Major Owens and Steve Bartlett, in a small committee in the House, worked day and night to focus attention on this particular bill and to keep everybody in line and to keep the White House aligned with the Congress. It was really, a drama that deserves far more attention than it gets today. And, it was an example of bipartisanship that a lot of people today have never experienced, never observed. And I hope to heaven's sakes that at some point in the future, we come back to that kind of leadership and government.
Yeah, I agree. You wish that we could have that now. The late, great Chuck Graham, who I got to meet through my ADA symposium. Chuck was with Midwest ADA Center at the time, I think. And I remember him telling me a story of the people who wanted to testify. The Capitol wasn't even really accessible. So like they couldn't even get in the building, and can you give reflections on that, Bobby, of how did that help hammer it home with some lawmakers?
Yes, and it also became a major controversy because Senator Grassley, Senator Harkin wanted to ensure that the ADA included Congress. And this would have been the first civil rights statute that actually made the provisions of the ADA applicable to Congress. And it was included. And I think we've seen some dramatic steps taken in the last 30 years, not to say that all is well in that regard.
Lex, this question is really for you. Now that the ADA was enacted, what are some of the core principles to carry away when thinking about the ADA? And if you could talk about the paradigm shift, and Bobby, I know you want to follow up here, but really the paradigm shift from being seen as an individual / colleague by Dr. William Spencer and not as a patient, and how that was a catalyst for change.
Well, it's a good question. And I think this affected everybody with a disability and frankly, the whole society, because through the process of developing the ADA, those of us with disabilities began to feel empowered, and we sort of defined ourselves differently as the process went on. One of the main paradigm shifts caused by the ADA was the shift from a medical model to a social model of understanding disability. Prior to the ADA discussion, if you were going to talk about disability, well, in the first place, you were talking about handicap, not disability. Language changed, but in the discussion, and those of you who are on the audience who are rehabilitation counselors will surely recall that everything used to be in the context of the medical model. It was all about diagnosis. And that paradigm shift from the medical model to the social model, where we stopped worrying so much about fixing the individual and began to be concerned about altering the environment so that people with disabilities, regardless of their impairments, could be functional, that's big. I mean, that was a huge societal change that affected not only the United States, but the way we look at disability around the world. I think
Yes.
that's important. But David, we also in the process shifted from diagnosis to function. And finally, we shifted from this view that there were disability rights to the view that disability rights were civil rights. And that actually, that paradigm shift has occurred more post ADA than it did before ADA, because there was still questions about the extent to which disability rights was interchangeable with civil rights right up until the time the ADA passed, I would say. So, you know, there were several shifts in paradigm that I think we can look back at the ADA and change. We changed the way people look at disability, and hopefully people don't go back to Aristotle.
No, let's hope we keep moving forward, not go backward. Bobby, I do want to get your prerogative on the paradigm shift, because really you talk about something that now we take for granted, but to me is so essential.
Statutorily in the ADA, there was a couple of provisions or policy statements that are critical. Remember the old paradigm where you looked at people with disabilities as defective, pitied, in need of fixing. The result was policymakers took those values and then had exclusion and segregation and denial as the policies. The ADA enunciates a whole different paradigm based consistent with what Lex is talking about. The sentence is, disability is a natural and normal part of the human experience that in no way diminishes a person's right to fully participate in all aspects of society. Think about the difference as a state policymaker. If you start with the paradigm that you need to be pitied, you go in a certain direction. If you start with disability as a natural part of the human experience, you go in a whole different direction of inclusion, of opportunity. And that's why the 4 goals of disability policy that Dina made mention of at the beginning are so critical. Equality of opportunity. That means treat people as individuals based on facts, objective evidence, and science, not fear, ignorance, and prejudice. Effective and meaningful opportunity. All means all. Provide services in the most integrated setting appropriate, where the default, the priority, the presumption, competitive integrated employment. The notion of full participation, as was said by David, nothing about us without us, self-determination, informed choice. Then we have the recognition of the legitimate outcomes of our public policy should be economic self-sufficiency and independent living.
I don't want to think of life without these provisions, I'll tell you that. So thank you again to both of you. As we continue to move on here, this question is directed at Lex. And Lex, I know you want to bring in some environmental factors here. What do you think were the biggest changes to arise from the ADA? And speaking more again to the paradigm shift and about the environment.
Well, most of them are apparent to anybody who can recall 30 years ago. Before the ADA, there were literally 2 transit systems in the United States where a person with a disability could get on a public vehicle and travel across town. After the ADA, literally within months, every transit system in the United States began to purchase vehicles that were fully accessible. And now every transit system, I could go anywhere in the United States and use public transportation. and not just the paratransit that's required by ADA. That's important. Paratransit is alive and well because of the ADA. A lot of people miss that, but ADA requires the paratransit system. Without it, some cities might not have that door-to-door backup to the over-the-road coaches. But now we can use the public system, and we have the benefit, if we need it, of the paratransit system to ensure that we can interact with the community in transit. But we've seen steps disappear, turn into ramps. We've seen doorways on bathrooms be widened. It's, you know, the sad thing to me is that things don't happen as quickly as we might hope they would. We negotiated away some things in the ADA that people don't talk about. At one point, we had a limitation on the number of years that would be required before someone could actually make accommodations in the workplace. At some point, that sort of drifted away, and we got into this business about new buildings and how long you had to wait until you made a new building and what a substantial modification was that would require you to become accessible and so on. So we've had issues with that, but in large part, the physical environment has been substantially affected by ADA. And I think the attitudinal environment as well. I think people see folks with disabilities in a different framework. Clearly in schools, we have opportunities we didn't have before. The biggest gap, and it's measurable, is in the area of employment. But we never said that ADA was a full employment bill. ADA doesn't have any provisions in it that require employers to hire people with disabilities. It requires people to give people with disabilities an equal opportunity. But when we look at the data and we take, for example, a case where there are 3 finalists for a job, one of them has a disability, the odds are the person with the disability would be hired 1 out of 3 times, assuming the 3 were equal. But in reality, if you look at reality, that person is not hired 1 out of 3 times, and maybe more like 1 out of 10 times. So there's still a kind of underlying gap there in the way we say we think about disabilities and the way we behave when it comes down to making decisions for where we're going to place the bets on our employees. And, you know, Jill's far more qualified to talk about that than I am.
Yeah, with 2/3 of all working age people with disabilities not in the labor force, it keeps me up at night for myself, for my consumers, for my daughter, what the prospects are. So, but I do want to stay on this. We're going to be transitioning into Jill here, but Lex, I do want to follow up with you in our preparation. I think you explained an example of the shift in treatment and your life when Dr. William Spencer introduced you to another legend in the rehabilitation field. Can you describe to us that paradigm shift from being seen as an individual and a patient a little bit more there?
Yeah, I mean, it's one that many people with disabilities have experienced and others may not have. But the reality is that regardless of where we are, and particularly if we're in the vicinity or with the in partnership, and we say partnership sometimes in a loose kind of framework, people continue to see us as they are trained to look at this, to look at us. And so, for example, counselors see us as their patients or their subjects, and doctors see us as their patients. And so we bear a certain label as the person who's being helped, as the person who's receiving services. And years and years ago, in about 1974, just a few years after I was injured, I had the opportunity to travel with a person who I regarded as my mentor, who had founded the Rehabilitation Hospital in Houston, William A. Spencer. And we were in New York. Dr. Spencer had asked me to accompany him there because he saw me as an intern, an up and coming interested person in rehabilitation. and he wanted to try and help educate me. So he took me with him on a trip to the Rusk Institute in New York, at the time the preeminent rehabilitation center in the world, led by Howard Rusk. And at some point, Dr. Spencer saw Dr. Rusk, and the two walked together and began to converse. And I sat back at the end of the hall and watched and oohed and awed. I mean, here are the two legends in medical rehabilitation. And oh my goodness, I get to see, live this famous Dr. Howard Rusk. And Dr. Spencer waved me over to them and he said, Dr. Rusk, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Lex Frieden. And when he said that, I was speechless, because I expected him to say my intern, my patient, a student that I'm trying to help educate, but instead he called me a colleague. And I'll live forever with the thought that I'm responsible now to live up to that recognition. That if Howard Rusk and Bill Spencer considered me to be a colleague, then I need to stand up and do everything I can to meet those expectations and to live up with that recognition. And it had a profound impact on the way I saw myself.
Lex, thank you for sharing that story. That is tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. So now we're going to shift to our next section, success and opportunities for the ADA. And again, 20 minutes, you might have heard my timer just go off there. So let's talk a little bit about program and policy options for states and the private sector. We'll start with the private sector, then we'll go to states. So Jill, let's start with you. What are some of the programs that keep private employers away from employing people with disabilities, and what are some of the programs that private employers are using to implement to help achieve inclusion?
So let me, speaking about Lex talking about being in the back of the hall and oohing and ahhing, that's how I feel on this webinar, listening to both Lex and Bobby, right? Two of our leaders and mentors who paid it forward and allowed you and I to join the party. So to your question, just to level set, I lead an organization called DisabilityOwned that really grew out of government. It grew out of what used to be the President's Committee on the Employment of People with Disabilities. And at the time, under the Clinton administration, it was chaired by Tony Coelho. And there was an employer subcommittee. And so government, in partnership with business, believed that the one thing that the ADA couldn't do was legislate attitudes, and that business has the power to, they're competitive, right? That they have the power to change the world, that if one company is doing something that's beneficial for the bottom line, the other company wants to know what it is and do it better. And that's really who DisabilityOwned is. So that's like where we came from, and we are the intersection of where business and talent with disabilities intersect. So when we talk about best practices and programs, there are many. But I will tell you that we have a tool called the Disability Equality Index that we joined forces with the American Association of People with Disabilities to create. And actually, I got guidance from Bobby along the way, who, when we were creating that tool, he said, if you do not include cross disability, and if you do not include lawyers, you will come up with some of the greatest questions in the world. But if legal says business can't answer them, they won't. So we listened, and we have an advisory committee that created a tool called the Disability Equality Index that looks at culture and leadership, enterprise-wide access, employment practices, community engagement, supplier diversity, and non-US operations, contains weighted and non-weighted questions. You have to substantiate your answers. Takes more than 40 hours to complete. And we tell the world who got an 80, a 90, or 100. And it's important to point out that those that do well are not perfect. It does not mean perfection. It does not mean by any, means that they've got it all figured out. What it means is that they're committed to identifying opportunities for disability inclusion and to doing better. So to your question, what are some of the things that they're getting right? Well, this year we had 247 companies participate, up from 180 last year. And some of the best practices are things that we can embrace, like 89% of the top scoring companies have external recruitment hiring of people with disabilities, and they set goals that they hold themselves accountable for. Obviously, a best practice is, it's one thing to have a reasonable accommodation policy. Everybody's got a policy, but do your employees know what it is, and do they have multiple ways to access it? 94% of top scoring companies not only have the policy, but their employees know where to find the policy in multiple ways. And I'll call out one more data point, which is just that a lot of these big companies have diversity and inclusion councils that have a link to the CEO. Only 88% of them, although that's an increase, include disability. And I think that that's really important that we have a seat in that, at that table. So I'm going to be quiet, but those are just a few things that I would call out.
No, that's terrific. And I'm going to follow up with you because I want to hear more about that. But right now I want to go to Bobby. So Bobby, Jill just gave us the impact from the private sector and from businesses. What are states doing, and what have been the biggest changes within states?
Well, to answer that question, I first step back. We've mentioned the word SEED, State Exchange of Employment and Disability, a number of times. SEED was established by the was funded by the Office of Disability Employment Policy, but it's a very interesting approach. It basically, the partners, the key players are the Council of State Government, CSG West, NCSL, NGA, to name a few, where the approach is state policymakers know what they need and work with the organizations. So the C team has developed, with all of these intermediaries, a bunch of resources. In general, a work matters report that has 200 different examples of state policies. We update that every month. So if a state policymaker on the phone is interested in disability policy, we have the resources to help research, do gap analysis in a state, to draft legislation, and provide examples of policy options. So COVID-19, we've developed a telework policy guide so that you know exactly what's happening in general and for people with disabilities. Stay at work, return to work, CSG has a toolkit. So we know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've policy states are becoming model employers of people with disabilities. So we have examples of that, of what states are doing to get engage the private sector, ranging from things like requiring state contractors to have goals and develop plans, to incentives for doing accommodations and hiring people with disabilities. We have examples of youth transition, interagency collaboration, transportation, and issues of disability-owned businesses.
Yes.
So states are doing all kinds of exciting things, and the SEED project provides a resource to help states learn from their colleagues, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Thanks, Bobby. And I want to go back to Jill. You actually teed it up nicely for her. Jill, we were together in Massachusetts when Governor Baker, plug for Massachusetts here, when Governor Baker announced disability-owned business enterprises. Can you tell us how these policies are impacting businesses and the people with disabilities employed in these businesses? What are you seeing?
So, I mean, obviously we know that self-employment is a form of employment. And it was a great honor to work with Governor Baker in Massachusetts as he issued the executive order and worked together with you, David, to actually include disability-owned businesses in state procurement. We've got a long ways to go. We have a few states, a handful of cities across this nation that recognize disability-owned businesses. I want to call out that it's actually a best practice. And we have state treasurers from across the nation and comptrollers, actually led by Comptroller DiNapoli of New York State in partnership with Treasurer Tobias Reed from Oregon, who formed a joint investor statement on disability inclusion. And they're shining a light on some best practices. And one of the 6 things that they're shining a light on specifically is including disability-owned businesses and service-disabled veteran disability-owned businesses in procurement.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's great to know that businesses are really trending that way and interested in opportunities and really being entrepreneurial. I think it's a bright future on that. So there's still ways to go. But I do want to bring in Lex here too. Lex, I know you have some thoughts on best practices that you want to share also.
Well, I've met with a lot of managers and business people, corporate people here in Houston and around the state and nation. And most effective managers don't like to think in terms of quotas. They realize that when they set quotas for production, quotas for hiring, any kind of quota, they wind up with people trying to meet a quota and really not looking at the quality of the work that they are doing. And I find that really effective managers are those who set goals and objectives, and that they have an approach that will lead them to meeting those goals and objectives, and that those approaches are not simply to delegate responsibility to a single individual or a single department, but to change effectively the culture of the company to embrace the goals and objectives of the company. And I really do find that companies, that businesses, that managers who approach hiring people with disabilities and finding productivity among people with disabilities are those who see the big picture, who can understand that we all have a contribution to make, and it's up to the manager, up to the coach, to see where every player fits best and the team wins. And frankly, I think this whole pandemic experience has given employers maybe new insights on the opportunities to use people with disabilities as workers in their companies, because we used to beg to have employers consider certain people with disabilities as candidates for telework, and the employers would say, no, we don't believe in that paradigm. We don't think that employees can be effective unless they're in the workplace, unless we can see them clock in at a given time. Well, what I forgot about was those employees were getting up at 6 in the morning and showering and dressing and driving for 2 hours to work, and then taking their coats off and having their coffee, and already 5 hours has passed in the day and they're just now getting to work. Whereas working at home, we have all become more productive. And, it is something that I think will affect employment opportunities for people with disabilities going forward.
Yeah, two things to add here personally. So I think I'm paraphrasing President Roosevelt when he said something to the effect of, sometimes the best person for a job is the person with the disability, right? And Jill, to your point, these businesses are smart and they recognize that depending upon which definition of disability you use, but somewhere between 12 and 20% of the population are people with disabilities. One, there's a lot of talent in that pool. Companies are continually trying to get talent. But the other is, that's a market share that you want to try to appeal to as well. They have spending power.
David, could I just follow up with
Yeah,
two
sure, Bobby.
points that Lex made? Let's start with the second one. The SEED project, working with CSG and NCSL and others, have developed a telework guide for state policymakers. What we did is we looked at 4, 5, 6, 7 state policies, statute regulatory manuals, and wrote a guide thematically looking at all the topics that folks have included in their policies, then did a checklist and did the same for telework as a reasonable accommodation. And then there are links to all of the state statutory, regulatory, and manuals on telework in general, and then for people with disabilities. So this is an example of a resource that exists for those who are re-examining telework as a public policy issue.
Hey, Bobby, I notice our organizers have put that link in the chat so you can click on that and go right to the document. One more question, and then we're going to go into question and answers. So if you do have question and answers, we're right at 1 o'clock. We do have about 25 minutes to go here. So we want to take your question and answers. We do have more that we're going through here, and then we can transition. So this is to the panel, though. This is kind of an open-ended, and then we can transition into Q&A here. And really, there's some larger principles here in terms of universal design and inclusion and the benefits that universal design bring. Do we have a slide on that too? But Jill, I want to get your impression first. If you could talk about inclusion and the benefits of universal design and how you see it being implemented in these companies.
Well, I mean, clearly the benefits of universal design are that, it creates an environment that's accessible for everybody. And so when we're creating an environment that's accessible for everybody, it's going to have an impact on the culture. And to I think what Lex was talking about earlier, I mean, there's some kind of saying, something about how culture eats strategies for breakfast every day of the week. It's something along those lines. And universal design and having that impact on the culture is an important part of the equation. And so it's looking at not just things like access to a building, but it's looking at things like emergency exits and lighting, and it goes beyond, right? It also goes to technology, right, which is our new front door. If payroll isn't accessible, then the culture that we're creating is excluding a group of talent that we can't afford to ignore. So there's a real opportunity.
Thank you, Jill. Bobby or Lex?
Well, I would say there are lots of opportunities, and let me give you 2 examples. One is in the area of telemedicine. Again, the pandemic has brought us to the point where regulations in states are being relaxed so that physicians and other caregivers can meet their patients via a more practical avenue, and that would be using video and audio connection to patients rather than having them wait in a nursing home for hours, or wait in a waiting room in a clinic for hours, or actually having them travel for miles and miles to get to an appointment. Now we just connect via telemedicine. And this is a, here's an opportunity that's right under our thumbs now. But just like the issues that Jill raised in terms of the internet, we need to make sure they're fully inclusive. And a lot of telemedicine is being practiced now, where doctors are simply using FaceTime as a substitute for the telephone, and
Yes.
really not effectively practicing with the telemedicine. So
and platforms like this.
exactly, and so we need to figure out how to more effectively use telemedicine, how to make it and the internet more accessible to people with visual impairments, hearing impairments,
Yes.
people who have difficulty navigating, people with learning disabilities, and others. These are challenges that we need to hurry and meet. And among the things that we're doing as a practical example, here in Houston, I have the honor to serve on the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Houston and Harris County. And in that capacity, I have observed that it doesn't do any good to have an accessible bus at a stop if people can't get down the street to the bus stop. We are in the process of making more than 900 bus stops in the Houston area. In the beginning, the objective of the transit agency was to make them meet the minimum standards of ADA accessibility so that we wouldn't be sued. But that shortly changed in the dialogue to talking about universal accessibility. And now multiple agencies are committed to working together in our city to be sure that people can use the sidewalks, they can use the passageways throughout the community so that the transit system actually becomes useful to everybody. And that's having a huge impact, not only on people who use wheelchairs and walkers, but on ordinary citizens who used to stumble and break their ankles walking down the broken sidewalks.
Yes. Yes. Next question, Bobby, and then Jill. So as states and businesses react and implement policies to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, how has the ADA helped shape that discussion?
Well, again, it is this same follow the themes of universal design. When you are designing or developing a policy, and these are new policies, it is absolutely critical that people with disabilities, their representatives, those with expertise are at the table. So you are not retrofitting the policy, you are designing it, not only buildings, you are designing the policy, the programs, the services, the supports that take into consideration the needs of the greatest number of people, including people with disabilities. Now, SEED has developed another resource which puts in one place all of the federal policies on COVID-19 employment from a disability perspective. So they're, instead of spending 5-10 hours researching, we have put in one place all of them with links to the policies, and they're updated every week.
I think they're putting that in the chat as we speak, the link to that, Bobby. Jill, over to you. Give us a business, how they're reacting to COVID-19 and how the ADA is impacting there.
So, I think it's to what Bobby just talked about. I would tell you that the greatest resource that whether it's business or government has are its people. And one of the best places to go and interact with your people is through your employee resource groups, and specifically your disability employee resource group, right?
Yeah.
And that if we're going to work on making, whether it's return to work or how we work from home, accessible to all, inclusive for all. The best place to, to go and engage is with our people at our employee resource groups.
Yes, good. Thank you for that best practice. So Lex, over to you. I know you have quite a bit of experience with disaster preparedness here from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So how can we ensure that people with disabilities are part of the plan? And how does that translate to really the crisis that we're going through, the disaster that we're going through right now with COVID-19?
Well, I mean, the issue's been addressed here already, and that is in terms of engaging people with disabilities in the process. There were huge gaps, and people died as a result of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita because people with disabilities had not been involved in the process of planning ahead of time. And so people with disabilities were put on trains and moved to states further north, away from their family. Some of those people are living in nursing homes in Tennessee today that were moved back in 2005 with the promise that they would get back home as soon as possible to their homes near New Orleans. And it's just, that was bad planning, and it's really had a huge troublesome impact on a lot of people. But now we include people with disabilities in the planning process. And most communities have individuals with disabilities that are engaged in almost weekly planning exercises for disasters, and some not so frequently, but even when the disaster planning occurs, the population of people with disabilities should be represented, and in most communities they are today. But now we have a new problem, and that is these committees in communities that are led by public agencies and some private that are meeting to help solve the pandemic problem. What are we going to do? How are we going to provide appropriate health care, long-term services, and so on? People with disabilities have not been effectively involved in those committees. So we wind up having statewide policies that affect us that in fact would ration services to us without regard to what our productivity is, what our personhood means, or what the value of our lives are. That's a gap. It's a failure. Yet again, we are building these policy organizations without thought of ensuring people with disabilities are at the table and represented in the discussion. And there are just too many people who think they know how we think, and they know what we want, and think they know what's best for us.
Yeah.
We're
asking for chocolate chip cookies. They're handing us sugar cookies with a bunch of chocolate chips and asking us to just go put it in. And it's not baked in, and it's not the same thing. You're right. You're right. So Jill, I do want to go back to you for a minute though, back to the telework, because that's related to the COVID situation here. So can you tell us some strategies that employers are taking to increase access and opportunities for people with disabilities regarding telework?
Well, I mean, I think right now, most of the companies that we're working with at Disability In are remote. Their workforces are working from home, and they're probably going to be working from home for the foreseeable future. They're talking about, through June 2021. I think one of the things that we're seeing that has been a silver lining in this is that there's been a real opportunity to lead with humanity and to really get to know your people. And so, it used to be that if you were on a call and there's a dog in the background, you may be annoyed, and now it's like an opportunity to be like, I didn't know you had a dog.
Yeah, right.
And you're getting to know each other on a different level. I also think that as we're getting to know each other on a different level, we're learning things about the needs of our people, right? We're learning that how to turn on captions, how to pin an interpreter, how to audio describe a video that we're going to be, watching as a team. Listen, we have got an incredible amount of work to do. We're just barely scratching the surface, but I think that there is a silver lining that really shines a light on on mental health and shines a light on accessibility, and that we have got a lot of work to do in those hills.
Yeah, I agree. You've all raised such great points, Lex, Jill. I really believe that this telework, it ameliorates a lot of things. It ameliorates transportation. It brings down a lot of the other barriers. So it really does provide a lot of opportunities for people with disabilities going forward. I think we have about 10 minutes left here. So as we start to now conclude, we're taking our way all the way through the ADA. But let's talk about the future. Let's talk about maybe there's some goals or gaps that you see in the disability rights movement going forward. If we could take a few minutes for each panelist here and just give us what your goals are or the gaps that you see or what you hope could come out of the next 30 years of the ADA. Maybe we'll start with Jill. Would you like to go first? Ladies first.
Absolutely. I would tell you that at DisabilityOwned, we are laser focused on growing the participation in the Disability Equality Index. So when we started this journey 7 years ago, we had 43 companies that came along. We're up to 247. Our goal is to get the Fortune 1000, right? The Fortune 1000 and all American Law 200 participating and joining us on the journey. Second of all, growing the number of disability-owned businesses, because with that comes more opportunity. And third of all, you know, I think a concern that we have, that we really want to work to shine a light on, it's just this talent, this next gen talent with disabilities. That we've got a mentoring program that we do every year. This year's class has 200 students from 110 unique universities. We work with a lot of state agencies like yours, David, thank you, to find this talent. They're 59% people of color, 47% women, 20% LGBTQ, 60% STEM. This is amazing talent. Our fear is that COVID and the pandemic creates additional barriers to internships and barriers to getting their feet in the door, that COVID, you know, and so it's really incumbent upon us that even if there's hiring freezes, that we're not forgetting this group of people, but that we're actually leaning in and working more with this next gen talent, because they're our future. So we've, you know, hiring will begin again. And let's not forget that talent. Let's be laser focused on getting them in and helping them climb.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill, for your advocacy and terrific work. I thank you so much. How about we go now to Lex Frieden.
Yes, sir. Thank you, David. And I appreciate your leadership and your moderation here today.
Thank
And
you.
I appreciate everybody being on the line and the sponsors of the program. This is really important, I think, and a great discussion here today. I think there are several things that need to occur. First of all, the disability movement itself needs to continue expanding. And frankly, the disability movement needs to become more movement. People need to discover and empower themselves through activism with the disability community at the local, state, and national levels. We need to expand the disability community to embrace leadership by people of color. We simply have too many people who have shared the same experience as part of the leadership of the disability community today, and that needs to be expanded dramatically. If we are to move forward, we need to ensure that we continue the cross-disability focus that Bobby mentioned. We can no longer move forward without a coalition of different types of disabilities, people with sensory impairments, mobility impairments, cognitive impairments, psychiatric illness, and so on. We all have to be together, just like that group was before they left the Methodist Church. And we need to continue our work to educate the society, because we've got a long way to go, and people still make assumptions, and they still have hidden biases that we need to eradicate and remove. We have a great opportunity here with the pandemic, because in many respects we've kind of leveled the playing field all at once. But that leads me to another issue that the disability movement needs to take on going forward in the next 30 years. You know, Olmstead was a great step forward. The Olmstead decision by the Supreme Court requires a least restrictive environment. Well, in reality, the least restrictive environment is independent living in the community by all people, including people with disabilities and older adults. We simply don't have enough accessible, affordable housing in the community for many people to live outside of institutions. They could move today if there were places for them to go. And finally, we don't have an infrastructure of community-based services and supports that will enable older adults to age in place as they wish, that will enable people with disabilities to live independently in the community with their families and friends and be viable employees in the workforce, students at schools, and active throughout our full economy, full commercial and full societal aspects. So I think, you know, we have some challenges moving forward, but we've shown in the last 30 years that we can step up, and we need to step forward now, looking for full inclusion and full participation.
Lex, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do, have done, will do. I've learned so much here today, and those are just great points. Thank you so much. And I think there is a question, but Bobby, let's go to you first, and then maybe we can follow up, and then we'll throw it back to Dina. So Bobby.
Great. I'm going to try to give you some policy issues for the state policymakers who are on the phone joining us for this webinar. First is web accessibility. So much of information and data is shared internet, intranet, in terms of what businesses do for intranet. We've got to make sure that websites, online systems, mobile apps are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Secondly, artificial intelligence is being adopted by more and more companies. It's awesome when it opens up reasonable accommodations, but it is frightening if it is used to screen people, if there are algorithm bias that results in the AI excluding qualified people with disabilities to even be considered for a job. You have to look at the gig economy, which is based on the use of platforms. The ADA is not going to protect independent contractors. It only protects employees. So some states are actually saying independent contractors, for purposes of discrimination laws, are covered. There's variation in terms of what state policies are adopting in regard to discrimination, but we have to deal with the gig economy. We have to look at personal assistance services and supports, which are not considered reasonable accommodations, but at the federal level are required as affirmative action. There are people, qualified people with disabilities, who cannot work without help in eating, clothing, and toileting. We have to look at centralized accommodation programs. It's one thing to say that you're entitled to an accommodation, but if a manager doesn't hire somebody because they're afraid that the accommodation is going to come out of their budget, that's still an issue that we have to address. So some companies are developing these centralized accommodation programs. Those are some of the issues. But one last thing, we are celebrating the ADA. We started with that. That's the title of this. The SEED project has developed model proclamations in response to requests by states for celebrating the anniversary. 17 states or so have already adopted it, but the SEED project has a template. There's also a template for developing task forces to systematically look at the state level at the issue of employment of people with disabilities and how state legislators can and state policymakers can enhance those opportunities.
Bobby, thank you so much for your wisdom, for everything that you have done, that you are doing and will do for the ADA. I know I'm a better person because the ADA is around. So I thank you all for the terrific participation here today and all the work, obviously, that you've been doing throughout your whole career. So to everybody in the webinar, thank you for joining us. We talked about pre-ADA, the creation of the ADA, successes and opportunities of the ADA. I think we covered a lot of topics here, but 30 years of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, very important. I'm humbled to be here and honored. Thank you so much to CSG team, the SEED team, everybody else involved. I'm going to turn it back over to Dina because I know she has some housekeeping about CSC credits and things like that. So it's David Darkangelo. Thank you all again for joining. It's been great being with you, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you to our fantastic panelists, and thank you so much, David, for being an incredible moderator. We so appreciate it. For those who asked questions, I apologize we're not able to get to them, but we'll do our best to address those by email if we can. So thank you all so much for submitting those, and we will try to address some of these on our future webinars moving forward. So that said, I would love to invite you all to join our other webinars within this series. So we'll have, this was the inaugurational piece, and we will have a webinar on August 13th on state as a model employer policies. So how do states act as model employers? What policies can they implement? How can they create a task force like the one Bobby was talking about? How can they encourage employment within their state? Can they install apprenticeship opportunities? Things like that, followed by webinars on youth transition, state work return to work, accessible transportation and technology, and ensuring a disability perspective in the state policy. So that schedule is up and available on our website, seed.csg.org. We hope that you visit it. A lot of the resources that we listed in the chat today are also available on that website. And then finally, if you'd like, we'd like to remind everyone that if you need a verification of completion for the CRC training, please complete the survey provided via email following this webinar, or you can post it in the chat box for us. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns, or if you're interested in technical assistance or connecting about anything that we talked about today. Thank you again to our speakers. Incredible session, and have a wonderful day.